Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we have a special treat. This is actually like 3 years late, really, today.
Yeah.
Because we have a special guest on the show that we've wanted to have on here to interview for a really long time. And we finally have been able to sit down and have a conversation with Dr. Dario Nardi, who is a neuroscience researcher. He's also a senior lecturer at UCLA. He's written multiple books. He's a published author. He conducts trainings and workshops around the world on personality type and, interestingly, how the brain shows up around personality. So we thought we would talk to Dario today about the neuroscience of personality and then probably branch out into some other topics and other conversations that are interest to us together. But Dario, welcome to Personality Hacker. We're glad you're here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And it's a delight. All this time I know we've been talking about it. And here we are.
Yeah. Finally. I think the first time we were like, hey, we should do a podcast together was like over a year ago. So it's good to finally nail this down and make it happen. And I think especially our audience will be, it depends on just how into type you are. A lot of people who listen to Personality Hacker are quite into type, and Dario's name has become fairly celebrated in the type community for helping bring what is a pretty soft, squishy science, if you even want to call it science. I like to refer it to more of a philosophy. But if we're going to bring this into the area or arena of science, Dario's work is how we're going to go about it. So I think a lot of people are pretty excited about the work that you're doing. And especially since it gives some credibility to this model that a lot of people have gained so much benefit from. So can you give us a little bit of a background or history or maybe some context around the work that you do in neuroscience research and as it relates to type?
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure. And it's been an amazing experience. 10 years ago, 10 years ago last month, I brought in my first EEG unit. So it's electroencephalogram, and it's designed to measure the activity on the surface of the brain. And I had a few students with me, and we were in one of the sort of department libraries and trying to find a little space to set it all up. And it's not like a big, scary fMRI machine where a person gets in a rumbling tube. It's a much more friendly experience. Yeah, there's a cap and some gel, and it's a little bit time-consuming, but it really is able to reveal all of what's going on the surface of the brain, the neocortex, the new brain, and which is the seat of education, all of the skills we develop. Consciousness is, we don't know exactly what that is, but it's certainly, you're not going to have much of it without a neocortex. And it's just been amazing ever since then. About 5 years ago, I put out a book, Neuroscience of Personality, which summed up the results of my pilot study at the time. And I know some people have taken that pilot study really seriously, and a lot has happened in those 5 years. I mean, good stuff. All the stuff in the book is still decent. But it just continues to be amazing to look at what happens when you do coaching, counseling, moving from college students to people at all ages, from 15 to 80 years old, looking at phenomena like midlife. What is that? What's happening with people's brains? And of course, people are curious if they know about the Jungian functions, the Myers-Briggs types, how that might relate. And I have to say, after about 4 years initially doing research, I pretty much threw up my hands thinking there really wasn't any relationship at all. But fortunately, I just chose a different way to approach looking at the data, and actually took the time to crunch out the numbers and saw, hey, actually there is significant stuff. So and there continues to be significant stuff.
Yeah. So what were you said there was a lot of people put a lot of stock in what you came up with or basically published 5 years ago, which was your early findings. And then now I know that you've basically gone on the road. I mean, we just met up not that long ago near Washington, D.C., and you were using EEG technology to basically, I'm assuming that the demographic you were working on was not college-age students. It was probably an older demographic. So what are some of the things that you've learned since you published your book 5 years ago? and especially as it relates to working with people in later time periods of their life than just college.
Yeah. Yeah, I originally chose college students not only because they were there and it was convenient, like most psychology research, but because I didn't want to have this sort of interference of career and lifetime, people would call it, type development. I wanted to get brains that would be most likely to represent people's types sort of as they are. And since then I branched out and really have come to appreciate there is a statistical relationship between brain activity, the brain wiring, and the various types. We can create a stereotypical picture of each type, like what's that going to look like in the brain. That said, working with people, in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 70s, whatnot, come to appreciate the role of career. Using the equipment is we're getting a snapshot of the developed self. And that's going to include personality, but also skills, the person's background, things that they developed in childhood are still going to be there. And the brain is very mixed in the way it does things. There's no like perception module or reasoning module or something like that. Every part of the brain is involved in perceiving, behavior, cognition, emotion, and in some way. And so a lot of it is continuing the process that I did during the pilot study, which is interviewing people afterward, getting feedback from them, helping them understand what the results mean, which helps me understand what the results mean as well. And so I would say I've really come to appreciate the role of development throughout our lives. That there is this quote, I think it's an Isabel Myers quote, but I could be wrong. It could be Mary McCulley, someone like that. That every ENFP is like every other ENFP, is like some other ENFPs, is like no other ENFP. And I think that's rather ironic, since ENFP is probably the one type that has the brain activity that's sort of most homogeneous. There's like 20 ENFPs, the chance that they're going to all look the same is pretty high. But for the most part, people are pretty different when you take into account their careers. You practice something every single day for 20 years or 5 days a week, that's going to come back, that's going to be in the brain. And, type is sort of irrelevant there. The other thing to keep in mind is the equipment I'm using looks at the neocortex, the new brain, but it doesn't look at the old brain, the limbic system, and it doesn't look at the whole distributed nervous system. And that's, autonomic responses throughout the body and all of that. So there's, I think it's careful, we want to be careful in saying like that this thing called type is quote just the brain or something like that. So that's why I caution people. It's not just about there being a pilot study before. Is that there's this automatic response, especially amongst neuroscientists, to say that mind and brain and psyche, those are all the same thing, that there's just neurons. Cognitive scientists would beg to differ. They would say mind is different than brain. Our computers can think in ways that we're sort of blasé about, but it's quite remarkable. And then there's this thing called psyche, which seems to include the environment and society and all of that. So type is about more than just these mental functions. In my view, type historian Peter Geyer in Australia has pointed out that type is not actually meant as a model. Jung did not intend it as a model. He never used that word. That type is meant as a therapeutic framework, that people are supposed to continuously engage with type or use type in order to help themselves or their patients or whatnot continue growing. And so the folks who just want to assign like different parts of the brain or whatnot, it's the same. People come to me, sometimes they want type clarification. And I have to be you're going to get a lot of feedback. You're going to get like 25 pages of feedback, and you're going to resonate with most of it, and it's going to bring up stuff that shows like, oh, you learned this as a child, and yeah, your career stuff is over here, and but it might illuminate their type quite a bit, but it might not, because we have an experience of ourselves, and that's also part of type.
So I'm sorry, I have to stop you for a personal reason right now. You said that ENFPs are homogenous? Is that what you just said? I'm an ENFP, and this is extremely interesting to me. Of
No,
all the
the
types, we
types-
look alike
yeah,
to each other more than anyone else?
That's absolutely correct. I think the reason
Wow.
is that ENFPs are sort of the poster child for like adaptable to any kind of environment. Like the way that they do things, they can pretty much go into any situation and just be ENFP and get through it. Um, yeah, and of course they develop some individual stuff along the way, especially if they say become Esquire. Law school is very different than being an ENFP. But for the most part, I think that's what it is. Where other types, especially the SJ folks, that they tend to be a lot more specialized.
Yeah, that actually makes sense. I just wanted to go back, to what you were saying, that there's a difference between just neurons versus the brain, the mind, the consciousness, all of that, and that depending upon which discipline you're talking about, or like who's in that discipline, they'll probably argue that the brain and the mind are separate, unless you're in neuroscience, and then you just say they're all the same. So basically what I was getting from you, and I just want to clarify this, is that type also could mirror that same phenomenon, in that it's almost like the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Like type almost runs, like the mind is more than just neural connections, and consciousness is more than just, like the equivalent to wiring, like in a computer. That type could also be something that's running almost meta of the functions themselves. Is that essentially the insinuation I got, or was I reading too much into that?
You're absolutely, what you said reflects a school of thought in cognitive science. This idea that consciousness, or the aspects of consciousness, sense of self, the way we organize or experience it, those could be emergent qualities that you can't locate in any particular part of the brain. It's about how all of it works together. And if there's sufficient complexity, of the right kinds of complexity, then you can get some kind of consciousness or type experience or whatnot. And I think this is really important when it comes to talking about type development, because of course most of us, as we learn about type, the first thing is like, oh my God, I'm this type. And we resonate with it, and especially for folks like myself, who are like 1 or 2% of the population, it's very exciting to see we're not complete oddballs, we're just rare, and that's okay. Then there's this other thing called type development, which is when people start to ask, hey, how can I develop my non-preferences or my shadow functions or whatever it is. Don't try developing your shadow functions. That sounds really frightening and unpleasant. But your non-preferred processes, so like the second and third, fourth processes, and I think you've talked about that, haven't you, as well? Like the value of actually going back and just working on your second, your auxiliary function, can be of great benefit.
I don't believe it's the entire picture, but we feel at Personality Hacker that if we could get like one message out in development, it would be focus on that auxiliary or co-pilot, what we call the co-pilot process, just to round it out, to get that extroverted or introverted attitude handled, and to get the other perceiving or judging process handled. So you can have all four of those things represented. Again, I don't think it's the entire picture, but it's one of those. If you can get one message out, that might be the most powerful, at least as far as we're concerned.
One of the journeys I've gone on in these 10 years is reframing how I think about psyche, personality, skills, all of that. And maybe this sounds bad, but I don't mean it to be. Moving away from type. In other words, having the roots and the tree of my understanding of people be based in the neuroscience results, and that type is a really great lens to use on a practical basis and to make meaning out of those results, rather than having this tree called type tree and then like decorating it with some neuroscience stuff. And what comes out of that is I think resonates really well with what you said about where the leverage is and making sure people are balanced in a certain way. Sort of like, one of the metaphors I use is the neocortex is like a company, and that company has two CEOs. And for a lot of people, adults, those two CEOs are going to be well developed. They communicate well. They're well connected to the rest of the brain. Teenagers, not so much. But there are people who are unbalanced there. And it really, in terms of the left and right prefrontal cortex, if the person's too right, we're going to see, in type terms, like over-perceiving. And if they're much more left prefrontal cortex, we're going to see an overabundance of judging in the type terms. Like the judging functions. And so I think people benefit from balance there. And the front and back of the brain. We know about the connections, and not just me, other people looking at the brain and introversion, extroversion, just as traits even. And that people more front of the brain, more extroverted, links that go directly from the senses right up to the neocortex, we react immediately, more extroverted behavior. And then more in the back, it's going to be more introverted, more integrating of new information, old information, checking it, making meaning out of it, all of that, integrating. Somebody who's all just in the back of the brain is going to find life tougher. They are going to be more introverted. There are benefits to it, but we have the culture that we live in. And the front of the brain, I've seen quite a number of extroverts with judging. That is pretty much like a big picture of the front of the brain is like very well developed. In the back of the brain there, I'm sort of wondering, well, when did you have a chance to develop that? So that would be more like their introverted function, but they haven't needed to develop it. So in this case here, I'm not trying to paint one-to-one equivalency, just saying like type is this framework that reminds us of the things that are important, like balance, for example. Balance between perception and judgment, rational and irrational, however it is that we want to divvy it up.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you've noticed? I wanted to talk a little bit about how the cognitive functions show up when you are looking at it through EEG, but I think actually I want to go a little different of tact, because people can read about that in your book, in Neuroscience of Personality, and it's a fascinating read, and I totally recommend anybody who has not read it to go do so. So go check that out, because you will see a lot of findings and a lot of really interesting concepts around how cognitive functions show up.
Yeah.
When it's, it just really, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
We'll have the link for that book right below this show.
Yeah.
So you can click on that and go order that.
Yeah, and the podcast notes. Go check it out. Well, I think because, Personality Hacker is fundamentally a personal development podcast, not so much a type podcast. We like all sorts of maps, models, perspectives to talk about the advantages and ways to optimize personal development. So what are some of the things that you've discovered about, and I'm going to go ahead and use midlife versus, we've already talked about this a little bit, but with midlife, the assumption is a person has, even if they're not into type development, into personal development, they probably have figured some stuff out. They probably have gone back and realized that some of their behaviors were not necessarily serving them, or they just, they're just with some maturity.
A lot of people hit reset buttons.
Yeah.
Like between the ages of 35 and 55, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And so what are some of the things, and my assumption, and I could be wrong on this, is that if you do personal development work, you might be able to get to that space faster. So what are some of the things that you've noticed in the same type with somebody who has done work development maturing versus somebody who has not? How does it show up in a contrast between two people of the same type, but one having done work and the other one having not?
I don't normally ask people how much work have you done or what kind of work. I assume, as you do, that people keep working on themselves in various ways, small and occasionally large. And there are a variety of phenomena that I see in light of that, like asking a person about their career and how do they feel about their career right now, and then how that's showing up in the brain. So I think I can answer your question, but maybe not directly.
Okay. Well, let me be more clear. You're an INTJ, so I'm sure that INTJs are probably very interesting to you when you're doing EEG work with them. Is there a difference you see in an INTJ that's young, maybe the relationship with their tertiary process of introverted feeling versus an INTJ that is older and their relationship, say, with their secondary process and their tertiary process?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just talk about INTJs then, as an example. One thing I noticed early on with INTJs and a few other types, NT types in particular, is that there are sort of two subtypes. There's the technical version and the creative version. And these show up really quite differently in the brain. And in fact, the creative INTP and creative INTJ have more in common in terms of brain wiring than the technical versions of one and creative of the other. So it's right there. There seems to be some choice or some developmental thing going on early on that happens even before the person is conscious of, I'm going to develop myself. Beyond that, let's fast forward a little bit to a person later, INTJ later in life, and I've had a chance to look at INTJs of all ages, male and female, different backgrounds, the psychology, engineering, and so on. One is that their careers will have made a difference. So if the INTJ is, say, an engineer or a film editor or something like that, anything that involves visual precision, that's going to show up. And so whether the person thought of that as development or not, then that's what's happened. They've developed a part of their brain that might seem like a skill, but does bias, what they trust in terms of information that they bring in, and even how they think about things. For my own personal development, what's sort of neat is looking at my brain, and not just the activity, but the wiring itself underneath, what networks are active through my regular day versus when I do meditation. So meditation for me is like, I hate meditation, I have to be honest. Getting into it, it's like, well, I have other things to do, I'm thinking about the time, but I know it has a good result. And one of the really neat things about seeing the brain activity, what convinced me that meditation is good for me, is that the networks that get active are very different. And that when I take a snapshot of meditation, Dario, that actually looks like almost my opposite type, an ISFP. An ISFP just going about their regular day, the stereotypical ISFP. So that for me is a kind of type development. Sure, I can do some things that better get in touch with my emotions or beliefs as part of my third function, or do some physical activities, the fourth function, and that's all great. But to practice those and make them a habit in the brain, or to do something that really shifts the brain into that space, I think that's the kind of thing that's really exciting. And says, now we're engaging in some kind of type development, keeping in mind that it's mostly skills, and that the actual work of type development, I believe, is quite difficult. And it's to actually live in the space of your opposite type or your opposite type functions in an appreciable way that impacts your life, like that can be dangerous and exciting and rewarding, all of those things.
Okay, cool. Is it okay if I monopolize just a little bit, Joel? Because I have some questions based on some stuff he said.
Of course, yeah. Okay. No, please keep going. This is good stuff.
All right, so my mind is referencing back to when you mentioned that ENFPs are the most homogeneous when observed through EEG scans. And then you mentioned that sensors, in particular SJs, that would be using introverted sensing as their cognitive function, that they're the most, did you say, I've heard the concept, and in fact, we even talk about the concept of introverted sensing being a very adaptable cognitive function.
Over time.
And is that basically what you're saying, is there was an adaptability there, or was there, you said variance?
No, they're more, he said they're more specific. They're more specialized. In how they show up on the EEG machine. Yeah,
I love that concept. Can we talk a little bit more about sensors and in particular that concept of them being more specialized?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the ways that the functions show up, is not just in terms of brain wiring or specific regions being more or less active. It's really about how the person uses the brain as a whole, how they develop as a whole. And it looks like, for example, like this whole brainstorm mode that's more common with folks with intuiting preference. That's very general. The whole brain gets involved, and the person can, it's like anything that's needed from the brain at any one moment, like it's there and it's ready. With sensing folks, particularly introverted sensing, I've seen some brains some brain wiring that's just so amazingly specific to how they do what they do. And why is this? Well, we talk about introverted sensing as involving, it's just as a behavior repetition. So liking practice, the SJ types, they like practice. They want to get it right. So if we repeat something a certain way or 10 different ways, we're going to learn those over the years, and they're going to be deeply ingrained and very specific. So I would absolutely agree that introverted sensing is this function that's, as you said, adaptable and within a specific domain over a long period of time. Very different than maybe extroverted sensing, which is adaptable in the short term and in the moment. And itself, like, it shows up in different ways. Like the introverted SP type is pretty different than the extroverted ones.
So in practicality, if you say something to someone who's maybe introverted sensing primary person that's out of their frame, from what's happening on a brain level is you're saying something or you're presenting some information out of their frame, and they're used to going in a specific pattern to access parts of their brain. You're giving them a piece of information that doesn't fit. It almost throws them for a loop because there's no already pre-designed pathway to access how to interpret that information or that piece of data you've thrown at them that's so out of what their experience has been up till now. And that's why maybe an introverted sensing person reacts so much like they look at you like you're a weirdo or they're confused on the data point because it's not something they've had to encounter before. And so there's no pathway there built already. It's a new piece of information. Now they've got to find how to reconcile that against. Is that, I mean, I know I'm dumbing that way down from the scientific elements of it, but is that basically what's happening here?
Yeah, basically that's what's happening, that the person has built up a network in the brain of responding in certain ways in certain situations. They really trust that. The brain is just very automatic with it. And if you suggest something different, it's sort of like, as a metaphor, opening up a can. Okay, there's a certain way to open a can. I'm talking about one where you sort of have to twist off the top, and you're going to hold it with one hand and twist off with the other hand, and then intuitor comes along and says, hey, why don't I try opening it with my toes? And if the brain wiring isn't there for that, and it sort of seems suboptimal or weird or whatever it is, I suspect that's what their experience is like.
You mentioned just now that an introvert that is using extroverted sensing is very different than an extrovert using extroverted sensing. How are those different?
The introverts who use extroverted sensing, I mean, then extroverted sensing is not their primary function. It's not their lead function. That a lot of times, like if they're creative, let's say a very creative ISFP, that person is going to look basically like an intuiting type. I mean, may even be indistinguishable. And that makes sense because their third function is intuiting as a function anyway. And the same with ISTP. And so that's, I think it's just what happens developmentally, getting back to that midlife thing. I may believe by midlife people have their third function maybe not in a mature way, but it is integrated into the person's skills and their personality and so on. Sort of like with my type INTJs, most INTJs actually have pretty good activity and awareness around voice tone and intention. I hear those things. They inform me just as they would any FP type with introverted feeling. But the difference is I don't necessarily know what to do with that information. I may just ignore it, but I am aware of it. And so that resource is there. And I think that's the same thing that somebody with extroverted sensing, if they've gone in and done the sort of introverted intuiting work, that they will have developed along different lines and they'll look different. Whereas dominant extroverted sensors, like their brains tend to be pretty even in their development, like left, right hemisphere, front, back, whatever it is. They're just sort of they have whatever brain resources needed at the time, not any strong bias one way or another. I mean, of course, any one person might have some biases. The difference is that their parts of the brain activate based on what the context is asking for, not like a extroverted intuiting type who's like, yeah, let's throw in some brain functions that seem completely unrelated to what's going on in this context, just to see like if we get an insight from it or can do something different.
Yeah. Oh, that's super interesting. So you mentioned that at least by midlife, everybody has at least an integrated or has integrated a portion of that tertiary process. And I would say that my observation has been that the more you focus on developing your auxiliary or secondary process, the faster you actually get to that tertiary. At least in my experience, that if a person really focuses and hones in on that auxiliary and like gets it up to a very like proficient, effective level, it feels like we dip into that tertiary a little quicker. Has that at all been your experience? I mean, I'm going from a very personal development frame, and so you're going from more of like observing what happens with the EEGs, not necessarily behavior. But has any pattern played out for you in accessing that tertiary process faster with higher proficiency of the auxiliary?
Well, I would say from a personal point of view, certainly, because the more I might engage with extroverted thinking, things like organizing my day, I also need to prioritize and think about what's important, because I can't do everything. So I need to focus on certain things. What is important? Who is important? So that element of importance, then introverted feeling is going to come into it. I think that's sort of like a simple version of introverted feeling. There's a more complex version, but I won't get into that unless you want me to. In terms of the EEG, I sit there and I observe the person engaging in the tasks, like they engage in a 1-hour protocol. I'm pretty standard about that protocol right now. I have been for years. It involves social elements to it. I debrief the person afterwards. We talk about their report and their results. I learn about their life, that kind of thing. So I have some qualitative experience with EEG to answer that question. That certainly, when I look at just the resources that the person is drawing upon, that I see both their type and their opposite type in terms of the functions that are there. So it's inevitable, say looking at an ENFJ, that one of the regions of the brain strongly involved in reasoning, that aids us a bit in reasoning and the way that we think about, say, introverted thinking, like that's going to have wiring and be developed and be active. Not as the same way as, say, ISTP or INTP, but they're going to have that there. Part of their opposite type will be there. I think it's natural, if we're talking about opposite type, that opposite functions, yeah, that makes sense. And then the third piece of evidence is just looking at the prefrontal cortex and seeing that like the left prefrontal cortex links quite well to the judging functions, thinking and feeling. So if in the same with the right prefrontal cortex it links well with sensing and intuiting. I'm not saying that's the only place that they are. It's just one way to look at the brain. That if a person's second function is thinking, like for myself or like for you, then that's going to be the same region involved in feeling, which might seem weird, but I'll give a very specific example that I think a lot of people can relate to, especially with thinking preference, feeling preference. This is an area where there's a difference. In the right parietal lobe, there is a region involved. It's been implicated in like managing body, like detecting your body sensations, having empathy for others, and those tend to go together. So if you can feel it in yourself, am I hungry? Am I tired? Am I mad? Am I distraught? Am I joyous? That region also gets involved a lot in feeling what other people feel. So that really that sense of sympathy with others, that it's like the person who cries with you because they too are moved. That region is the same region that's involved, and we've seen this even in other studies, other people's research in economics on managing risk and uncertainty with money, information, whatever it is, working with many variables. People who are really good at math tend to use that same part of the brain. So it's almost like neighbors living next to each other. And you've got one region that's very extroverted feeling with some sensing, feeling your body and feeling what others feel. And then that's right next door to the part that's like this very introverted thinking, many variables, risk and uncertainty that helps us look for leverage points, all of that. And the brain has a number of regions that work like that. So it really is worthwhile to work on, sure, one part of the brain, but also knowing that right next to it is going to be its opposite.
That's
Yeah.
really interesting because anecdotally speaking, without the EEG machines and without brain scan, we've really identified in our practice and our work this idea of polarities. Every time you have extroverted feeling, you by definition have introverted thinking. And in a sense, this is more advanced than probably most people that are listening think about this, but I don't even think of cognitive functions anymore in isolation. I think of them in terms of their opposites in that polarity structure. Because I think that, and it's weird that the brain science bears that out in reality from what you're saying in the most recent years, understanding personality development it is definitely a dance between these seemingly opposite functions, but they worked so tightly together in some ways in our personalities.
Yeah, especially at a cognitive level, I believe that's there. There are other facets, though, where they are really very different. And I would say one is for all the people who like to do yoga or meditation or body work, any kind of physical activities that help them get in touch with their body. One of the things I found in looking at therapists and counselors' patients as they work with their client is the folks who come in with a sensing preference, usually, but sometimes feeling preference, who have really strong body connection. Okay, they feel as they're thinking. We see this as a connection to the limbic system, to the autonomic nervous system, all of that. That can show up as alpha waves in the EEG. And then there are folks who tend to be intuiting preference, and also some really strong thinking preference folks who are really detached from their bodies. And when you ask them to engage in an activity like feel for others, it's going to be cognitive experience, but they may not still be feeling it. And I recall this one time the therapist was working, she's coaching an INTJ, actually, to get into his body. And she was using sort of her normal routine of things, and that wasn't sufficient, that he was really, really heavily disassociated from his body. And she really needed to up her work there and get him to feel his toes, feel his hands, feel the weight of his body. Like every 15 seconds, she had to push him back into it. And I think that's an example where there can be tremendous divides between the types. The person who goes through life connected to their body, who's embodied, and the person who's sort of like a floating brain, who's not. And there are things that will always get all of us if it's a really strong experience. But I think that's an example where just like even the type preferences, S and N, T and F, like that is representing a real difference sometimes.
Have you noticed a difference? Are there differences as far as the brain scans showing up between sensing preferences and intuiting preferences in people? Is there a way that the brain lights up differently? Have you noticed any patterns? Are there differences, or is it pretty similar?
I would say there's three things that stand out that help differentiate sensing from intuiting in the brain. One of them is just the preponderance of regions that the person has come to rely upon. People with sensing preference tend to rely upon all of their senses, auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. Whereas people with intuiting preferences will rely upon one or two of those, but usually not all three, and usually it's the kinesthetic one that's left out, though not necessarily. And I'm talking about long-term brain wiring, not just like short-term stuff. That's one way. The other way is like what I've described, is the person connected with their body, even when they're showing lots of alpha waves, even when their eyes are open and they're doing some kind of tasks. They rely upon their gut feel and their memory and so on, all the things that the limbic system can provide to inform their experience. It's a felt experience. And that's the second way. A third way is really fascinating, and I still haven't quite untangled it because I discovered it by accident. As people do an hour's worth of activities, I can break it down exactly by which regions are active when and which senses are active. And I've noticed that people with an intuiting preference tend, and the word again is tend, to just completely stop using all of their senses fairly often. It might be just, like a quarter of the time, but for some people it really can be more than that. They just go into their head or directly into their body if they're like strong feeling preference, but all of the senses just become disengaged. Their eyes are open and they may be seeing, but they're not looking. They may be hearing, but they're not listening. Their body, they're probably not feeling at all. It's and I thought that's just amazing that they really can be detached even in terms of the senses. Even thinking that they're attached, they're actually, those parts of the brain are not active in the way that they are for someone with sensing preference.
That is very interesting because I actually identify as a kinesthetic ENFP. And when I get into flow, like let's say I'm doing something very creative, I'll later on in the day be like, man, my leg hurts. And I'll have this vague memory of like running into something maybe and bruising my leg, but not registering at the moment. It's like later I'm like, wow, why do I have this bruise in my leg? I'm like, oh, that's right. I ran my leg into that table when I was doing that creative project I was in flow around. That's totally what happened there. So I don't know if that's what's happening for me. Like I actually lose my sense of kinesthetic abilities when I'm like in that flow state, but that resonates with me what you're saying. What was surprising to you when in this research? What did you like, wow, I never expected this at all. This is totally throwing me for a loop, or this was a big surprise. What was surprising in your research?
All of it was surprising.
Oh, come on. You got to give me something better than that.
No, I know that sounds like a cop-out, but it really isn't. Actually, what's a surprise is that I keep being surprised. And I got to tell you, and I think I speak for a lot of people with INTJ preferences, we are not easily surprised. Okay, we think about the future. We look for what's going to happen and then to work around that or work with it. For me, to be constantly surprised is delightful because it's some of them are conundrums, but a lot of them are like, gee, that's really neat. Like state of flow, midlife, the just like how particular regions of the brain are the result, how they work, that functionality is the result of evolution. Type, and I would say a lot of personality models, a lot of those models are very logical in their layout. They're very structured. There's like A and not A, B and not B, X and Y. The brain didn't evolve like that. It's got some stuff crammed together as roommates in particular parts of the brain that at first blush are like, why do those go together? That doesn't make any sense. But when you dig deep down and think about it, it's like, wow, actually they do go together from a survival evolutionary perspective. And to me, that's very exciting. And just like every new domain that I go into, whether it's looking at people, like what happens during hypnosis, what happens when people enter other altered states, what happens when coaching, counseling, that kind of thing, people watching TV and movies, what happens with that? I recently did a thing, we interviewed 10 people, 5 liberals, 5 conservatives. They watched 4 clips, 2 each, of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And even then, the results of that were not unexpected, but they were really neat. And we did that, by the way, several weeks before the election, and I'm very pleased. I didn't make a prediction about the election. I wasn't a betting pool, and I did win it. But the point from the brain imaging, what popped out, one of the things so clearly, one is that people identified as liberal had very high tolerance for uncertainty. Not risk, but uncertainty. Like, you don't even know what's going to happen, which I thought was very interesting. And I was just giving them some stuff that's commonly used in economics experiments, and that was really neat to see. And then looking at things like engagement with the candidates. And, even if you don't like somebody, you may still be engaged with them. You may laugh at the jokes of the person you hate. And if the person you supposedly like doesn't excite your brain, then there'll be problems. In this case, Hillary Clinton and her voter turnout, which is in fact what happened. So that it's like sometimes it's really clear like that, and then sometimes it's just this whole broad, like about midlife, this idea that as people become really skilled in something, their brain goes from working really hard and putting energy into it, and those circuits are busy, to being able to get into a state of flow with it once they become experts, and they're also improvising, they're using their expertise in creative ways, to like actually having dead brain. I mean, it's sort of sad watching somebody who he does photo retouching. He's been doing it for years. Major magazines like People and Vogue and that kind of thing. He's probably, you've seen covers he's retouched. He does his brain. We sat him down with the computer. He's doing this thing that he's incredibly good at, that he gets paid well. And he may as well have been asleep. I wouldn't have been able to tell the difference.
Wow.
Yeah, it was just so to see things like that and be reminded, and what a horrible conundrum that places not only him but anybody who becomes an expert in something. If they're not wired to want to keep on doing it, which might just be for the SJ folks, the company wants to keep you, wants to pay you more, and you're like, oh my God, I'm so sick of this. I may as well be dead while I'm doing it. And then we want to go do something else, detrimental as that may be to our lives.
Yeah.
So I think it fits in when you talk about development. One of my concerns, since being even introduced within a few years of type, is development that's too quick and is too early. I think when we're ready for it, to make it quick is fantastic, to know how to optimize that experience. But I think type development can also happen too soon sometimes. And that's an example where the brain gets good at something. It's like, oh, I don't want to do it anymore. When I learned about type, I was like, wow, okay, so yeah, it explains why I'm in engineering, but I could develop like this other stuff. And then I started taking writing classes and this and that. And that was an expensive distraction, although I appreciate having done it.
Yeah, so that's basically probably where phrases like I could do it in my sleep comes from, I would imagine. Yeah. And then also, that's a really interesting concept of developing too early and then facing those conundrums of this thing that you loved, became an expert at, and now you're kind of done. Of course, I mean, as an ENTP, I will say that I go through that I go through that process about as fast as other people change their clothes. So to me, that's not a conundrum. That's just like how life is experienced. Is going like, okay, I've done this. What's next? So I get that too. I just, before, I know we're going to wrap up pretty soon. I want to say that I'd love to have you back, talk about type and altered, our cognitive functions in altered states. That sounds like a fascinating topic. I'd also love to talk about development and midlife with all the various types and going a little bit more deep dive. So we're going to talk about like the possibility of getting you back on the podcast soon to talk about all sorts of cool stuff. But before we wrap up, and I know Joel's got a question too, but I like this idea that all of the types are necessary in this social ecosystem. I also like the idea, and when I say I like the idea, it means that I am a proponent of this theory, though there is nothing to back it up other than my own, I'm fond of it. And this concept of a social ecosystem where the types are broken down to certain percentages, and that's the percentage that they need to be represented in society. So this idea of this social ecosystem. And you were mentioning before that, forgive me while I form this concept in my head, but I was remembering on Reddit, one of the top conversations on Reddit in the MBTI subreddit was around how whenever an intuitive type like gets a description, it's like really super flowery and awesome. And then whenever a sensor gets a type description, it's like the much more like neutered and bland version of it. Like an ENFJ is like this massive visionary that takes over everything, and like the ESFJ like bakes cookies or something, or is a school teacher. And when you were talking about how looking at it through EEGs, there's like a greater specialization, something popped up in my head, which is that if intuitives and and you mentioned ENFPs in particular are the most homogenous when seen through an EEG scan, is it possible that it's easier to create these like flowery descriptions of intuitives because they're all kind of more similar to each other than sensors that have a tendency to be more specialized in their unique way? So to find the trends among sensors is almost more difficult because they're more specialized in what they're doing, whereas intuitives kind of look a little bit more similar. So in this idea of the social ecosystem and why the types are broken down, I'm kind of formulating this concept that there might be higher percentages of sensors because there's more of a need for that mentality of specialization. There's more of a need for the mentality of like kind of focusing on one thing and getting exceptional at it. And that makes it harder to create like a generic type description of that certain type, like maybe say an ISFJ, because every ISFJ is like specialized in a very different way. Whereas INFJs have a tendency to be look a little bit more similar to each other. And therefore, the higher percentages of certain numbers means that we need more of that in the ecosystem because we need more of, say, of a specialization around introverted sensing. I'm just kind of spitballing here and thinking of it as we're talking, but I wanted to run this concept by you because it's coming up for me at the moment. Is that something that you've observed? I mean, if you're looking at it as on a macro as opposed to a micro, an individual, on a macro, does it feel like that kind of gels with how we relate to each other on like a macro social level?
Well, I certainly agree that for introverted sensing that they have, you could take 10 folks with preference for introverted sensing and train them all the same way and they'll look the same. And so that's, but in practice, we live in a very specialized society. We have lots and lots of subdisciplines. People learn different things. With the extroverted sensors, I think a lot of it is about context. And so even if 2 or 3 ESFPs, their brain wiring is fairly similar, their contexts may be very different. And so they're going to respond to different words, to different experiences, that kind of thing. I think with intuiting types, in some cases, I mean, a number of them, yeah, they're more homogeneous. I do think there's some important divides, like creative versus technical versions of like INTJ and INTP. But I also think that the intuiting types have more of an ability to abstract from what they're reading. To say like, oh, like this sentence, like they're talking about like engineering, and I realize I'm not actually an engineer. Like I'm a psychologist, say I'm not, but this person INTJ is going to say this, and think, well, yeah, but I can see like I approach my psychology in a very engineering sort of way, and so there's that stretch. So I think some of it is we can get away with that. I believe the other reason is that most type descriptions are written by people with intuiting preference.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and I'm happy to say that the project I did with Linda Behrens almost 20 years ago now, where and Stephanie Rogers, where Stephanie interviewed 4 people of each type. I mean, really been type verified. We recorded all of that and then used their language to create the type descriptions. That when you read those descriptions, in the 16 personality types by Linda Behrens and myself, they sound a lot more rich and in-depth. And then we also had an ENFJ come in and sort of look for biases. If you wanted to say some negative things too, people have negative stuff to say about each other, themselves, and make sure that was balanced. So really capture it in people's language. And I think when you do capture it in people's language, the differences between sensing and intuiting disappear a little bit. Not entirely, but the sensing ones sound more appealing. And the intuiting ones, the disadvantages are a little bit clearer. I would say it's like everybody engages in type development of all types. The difference often is that people develop more intuition, okay, that includes sensors who develop more intuition, are more aware that their process is going on. And that can feel neat and cool and have some benefits, but it also might be a distraction. We don't need to be aware of our developmental process for it to happen. And that's and then I think that gets into what you were sort of alluding to before, is this whole thing about development, and people keep thinking of development is in terms of the functions, which is great. But a lot of Jung's work after type, he talked about development like levels of consciousness in his talks in 1932 around Kundalini and consciousness and psychology, is like not related to type at all, but is still a tremendous tool for type development. So it's and answers, I think, some questions about like how embedded are people in their particular society or context, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I love it. I love all the conversations around the advantages and disadvantages of each of the types, and making sure that we recognize that all of us need to be represented in some way.
And I think that I would love to have you back on and talk about, at some point in the near future, Dario, about this idea of levels of consciousness. Like I've been reading a lot of John C. Lilly lately, who is, a big proponent of accessing different levels of your consciousness and engaging with your mind, basically through various things like psychedelics or also meditation, breath work, different methods of accessing those things. I think it's a really fascinating conversation. It can be a tool set for personal growth and really getting a sense of, your self-identity, where you're heading, all that. So I'd love to maybe have you back and talk more about that if you've had any, thoughts around that. But I do want to ask you, wrapping up here, I want you to put on your introverted intuition hat for a moment, because you're an INTJ. And I want you to reach that into the future. And I want you to paint me a picture of where do you think this is heading? Maybe some surprising things that maybe other people aren't thinking about, where typology and, being able to tie some scientific things like EEG machines into this experience of understanding type and typology. Where are we heading with type? Where can this be used in ways that maybe we haven't thought about yet? Have you given some thought to what's next for us in looking down the road of using typology as humans?
What immediately comes to mind, 2 things, but who knows, maybe I'll add a third. One is that type continues to have a powerful appeal to the general population as people learn about it, in a way that, say, 5-factor model or whatever simply does not. That it has endurance. And I believe that's not because it's some people will say, oh, it looks like astrology or whatever, which is actually baseless criticism. The type descriptions aren't anything like that. The framework isn't like that. And I believe it's because it speaks to people, it continues to speak to people at this very deep level, that sort of each of the 8 functions, there's a certain criticism that's like, you can't quite pin them down, you can't quite define them, and that in our scientific standards, we're like, oh, that's a bad thing. No, I think that's where its strength is, that anything that's organic is alive, and anything that's alive is not easily formalized or circumscribed into these exact definitions. People acknowledge that there's love, and we don't have exact definitions for love, and consciousness and development and all of these things. And I think it's beautiful and it's wonderful. And as long as type doesn't try and reduce itself to sort of like pander just to like a single, like, oh, let's make it very scientific and this and that. I know that sounds like the opposite of what I've been doing, but I really think that's where its strength is, that it just, people, when they feel free to keep engaging it, and it has this open, organic quality to it, it's very powerful, and it will continue to be as long as we don't dumb it down. I do think some rigor needs to be brought to the internet, and it's disappointing that a lot of professional organizations have not stepped up, and instead we have these forums and communities where people ask questions about type that have actually been thoroughly answered and, or addressed, like, oh, which professions go with which types? Like, let's brainstorm that. Nobody has done that. And I'm like, you fool. Like, there's a manual, the MBTI manual. Like, there's been literally dozens, hundreds of studies on that. So let's not, let's still keep our professional caliber with it, is what I'm saying. And I believe that the professional folks really need to step up creatively. And I love how the two of you are bringing this, like, you're affording this rich understanding of type. You're creating space for that. The third thing is that actually we still do need to engage in the neuroscience, though, and paint connections between type and neuroscience and all of the things that are going to be prominent in the 21st century. And whether that means research studies on how people do social networking, like whatever it is, to make type relevant to the current context. So it's always like balancing those two things. On the one hand, remaining relevant and speaking in those terms that society's gatekeepers expect. And on the other hand, maintaining that organic honesty that type asks of people. And then bridging between those two is going to be the professionals and professional organizations who are, doesn't even mean that they need to be certified in MBTI or type or whatever it is. It's just maintaining professionalism about it and being open and understanding how to balance those two sides of it.
Beautiful. I don't know if I could have said it better myself. That was amazing. I completely agree.
Thank you, Dario.
Yeah.
Now, if somebody's listening to this and they're like, okay, I got to find out more about this guy. I want to buy his books. I want to find out what he's all about. Do you have a website? Where can people find you? What's the best place to find you?
The best place to find me is www.darionardi, DarioNardi.com. You can also just type in my name, Dario Nardi, into Amazon. You will find books like Neuroscience of Personality and Our Brains in Color, which just came out this past year. Which is like a little bridge book, all in color, as it suggests, that has like all the new stuff about the brain, including the whole thing on development. But yeah, DarioNardi.com is the easy place. Or like I say, just Google my name, and I'm like 20 pages of stuff for some reason.
Right.
And of course, we'll have that in the podcast notes if you want an easy way to get those links.
So if you're listening right now, your assignment is to go and buy as many Dario Nardi books as you can right now. Afford. I mean, a couple $100, you get all of them. Maybe even less than that. I don't know. But yeah, go over to Amazon and get all his books and make him a happy man for being on our show by doing that for him. So thank you, Dario. We really appreciate you being here. I would love to have you back. If you're willing to in the future, we'll have to plan it out and figure out when we can have you back on the show. And I am wanting to come out and get my brain scan now in California. I want to come out to LA and hook up myself to this machine and just see how ENFP I actually am.
How homogenous,
how homogenous I actually am.
That's right. You could be special. I've looked at some people from foreign countries, and I can tell you, like a Taiwanese INFJ, not like the usual American INFJ.
Wow.
An Israeli ENFP, not quite the same as the other ENFPs that are American. So there's always room, absolutely. And you know what I love to do? Not just looking at teams, but when a couple comes and does it.
Oh, boy.
And to see how similar and different they are.
Oh.
I would love to do that with you.
Totally.
Antonia.
That would be amazing. All right. Let's
All right,
make
we're
that
going to
happen.
book our flights to LA very soon. And we're in person. We'll shoot some video and do some more podcasting. That'd be great.
Excellent, excellent. And we have no Christmas weather here. It's a beautiful day with the sun shining in the high 60s.
Nice. All right. Well, if you have a comment or question, head over to personalityhacker.com. You can leave that comment or question directly below this show in the comment area. And we'd also want to invite you to join our community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly magnanimous, you can gift us with a rating and review on iTunes. That really helps us out.
You know, at the time of this recording, we just passed our 2 millionth download. This happened this week. We did a big deal about the 1 millionth. We just passed 2 million downloads, and I just thought I'd mention that on the show. I'm really excited about that. Probably if you're listening in the future, we're way beyond that now, but that was a milestone that we didn't even we just blew past it. We didn't even hey, we're 2 million downloads now, but I'm really excited about that.
I am
It's really
too.
cool.
It's really cool. So thank you, everybody who was a part of
Yeah, thank you so much. Anyway, thank you very much, Dario, for being on the show. We're excited that you were here. Can't wait to have you back. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
that. And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We will talk with you on the next episode of the Personality Hacker podcast. Talk to you then.